All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Josephine Montoya. I'm the Prevention Program Analyst here at DoD SAPRO. We welcome all of our participants today, and by all means, if you get disconnected, we ask that you just reconnect, and we'll allow you back into the room so that you can continue to participate. To the right of your screen, you should have a chat box, and then that will allow you to talk with your peers, ask questions, and I will have Lieutenant Colonel David Holstead as our moderator today, so he will be answering or addressing questions as he can. For those of you that are still trying to get logged in, I will attempt to get you in before we actually get started with the content for today. So basically, let's go over a little bit of our ground rules for today. Um, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the presenter, our moderator, Lieutenant Colonel Holstead, we'll try to capture your question and we'll get the presenter's attention so that she can answer your questions. And then at the end, we'll have some time to start addressing any questions that everybody has and that they'd like to ask our guests today. So we are going to cover a little bit of what Dr. Edwards is going to present today, and we have our guest, Miss Julia Strange. And then we'll talk a little bit about, have some discussion questions and what your requirements are in order for you to get the CEUs. Purpose for today, this webinar is going to provide an overview on how to start to reframe Awareness Month activities and SAPA messaging from awareness and knowledge-based campaigns to more action-oriented, skill-building activities, not just during the month, but throughout the year. So we're going to also demonstrate to you how some of those practices and tools and activities can be converted into prevention activities as demonstrated in the Navy's Sexual Assault Awareness Month Toolkit. As always, we like to tie back what we're doing here today as part of our 2017-2021 SAPR strategic plan. It is a task that we gave ourselves to make sure that we continue and establish and facilitate and leverage prevention tools for prevention of sexual assault or other harmful behaviors. So before we get started with our presenters, what I'd like to do is run a poll question just to see exactly who might be in our audience today. Let me just get this poll question up. Okay. Give me just one moment. It is not going to pop up on my screen today. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you able to see that? Thanks for the heads up. I wasn't quite sure. All right, so the question we had was who was in our audience today so that our guest speakers can see who they're going to be addressing. And our categories ranged from some of the stakeholders that we invited, but we can see here already that we've got about 90% that are SAPR or SHARP personnel, and then we've got a few other categories. And if you'd like to just type in the chat box to let us know what other category, for example, if you're a commander or legal or SBC, or if you're just a service member and you're participating today because this is something that is of interest to you. All right. So we will broadcast that so that you can see. Okay. All right. So why are we here today? So the title, SAPR Event Planning Through a Prevention Lens, is kind of some new words and some new language that we ourselves here up at the DoD are trying to familiarize ourselves, especially when it comes to SAPR events or Sexual Assault Awareness Month and other things that we may be planning around the SAPR program. So the vast majority of our activities have been held as part of the DoD Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. They've historically been focused on building awareness of the problem and knowledge of the response system put in place to take care of victims. What we have to do now is it's time to shift that paradigm. And what Dr. Edwards will discuss with you all today is how the research has shown that awareness events and messaging are not enough to prompt the change in attitudes and behaviors needed to advance prevention efforts. So today we have with us Dr. Edwards. She is the founder and president of Alteristic and specializes in primary prevention and provides training and consultation in power-based personal violence, capacity building, program implementation, strategic planning, and community mobilization. So without any further ado, I would like to turn it now over to Dr. Edwards.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to be here and to be having a conversation with you all over the planet. So good morning or good afternoon or good evening, perhaps, depending on where you are. So I'm super excited. This is a topic that's really close to my heart. This notion of building on the success of those who came before and built such a mighty foundation on the response side, and wanting to kind of do my part to see if we can replicate, even in some small degree, what they have done on the response side on the prevention side. So I want to kind of start big picture and drill into a little bit SAPM and Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. But I want to start stepping back a little bit and kind of referencing what Josephine talked about. That when we first started dealing with the issue of sexual assault, we really did deal with it through a lens of response. Appropriately so, in my opinion, obviously, because when we're dealing with those who have already been harmed, of course our first priority is to make sure they get the support and the resources they need to begin their healing process. As that foundation was built, and we kind of had an opportunity to begin to look upstream and consider prevention, what we ended up doing was taking a lot of the ideas, a lot of the framing, a lot of the ways of thinking that we developed for response, and actually kind of stretching them over and overlaying them onto prevention. And as it turns out, when we began to, there really is an incredible echo. Is there still an echo on we're good? Okay. I apologize for that. They're still saying echo. Yeah, I hear it in my ear. Could it be related to the? No, this is unplugged. While dealing with technical difficulties, I would like to share a song with you to celebrate this holiday season. And Josephine is laughing because she knows she's going to have to edit all of this out, my singing. Could it be a volume issue on my end? How's that? Is that better? Oh, still echoing. How about this? Eisenberg for your. Let's see how it is. Is the echo gone at this point? Testing. Thank you so much for your patience, everyone. Really appreciate that. Keep us posted. While many of you may like to hear what I have to say once, then twice, and three times through the echo, most of you probably would prefer to only hear me once. So let me kind of build from here. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to build from here and let folks continue to um, do what they need to do to get this in the best shape for you all. Um, so we're talking about this notion of taking the systems, the language, the frameworks, the paradigms that were developed for response. And when we began prevention, we really layered that over onto prevention. And as it turns out, the content we develop for response actually isn't a good fit on prevention. Prevention and response actually have different goals. They have different target audiences. They are informed by different research. There are different skill sets necessary for actually implementing these two things successfully. And so what I want to do is give you a way to think about it that has kind of grown near and dear to my heart. I call it my toaster won't get my dishes clean. And so we end up with this problem, and to help you follow the metaphor, the dirty dishes obviously is sexual assault. And we need to get our dishes clean. We need to do prevention, right? And so what we did is we looked around our kitchen and we found the appliance that we already know works. It's appliance we've already been using, and it's an appliance that gets our toast golden brown each and every time, right? We went to our response appliance and we said, okay, I'm going to use this appliance and I'm going to work and I'm going to put it onto my dishes and get those clean. And unfortunately, obviously, the toaster didn't get those dishes clean. So what did we do? We said, you know what? That toaster didn't get the dishes clean, but I'm going to get some other toasters. I'm going to get bigger toasters, and I'm going to get a Mickey Mouse toaster and then a pretty silver toaster. And so we put more toasters at it. Obviously, still didn't get our dishes clean. So then what did we do? We did a training on toaster usage, right? If we all can just use our toaster more effectively, we'll get where we need to go. Obviously didn't work. What do we do now? We do some toaster webinars, then we do a couple of toaster roundtables, then we look up and we still have our dishes clean and our dishes dirty. And obviously the moral of this story is that it was never about, right, the toaster. The toaster's not broken. Response is not broken. Response is doing what it needs to do. The issue is that the toaster was never designed to clean the dishes. So it's time to learn a new appliance, right? And so prevention obviously is this dishwasher. And how can we begin to collectively build our competence using the dishwasher, even while honoring the importance of ongoing toaster usage? So I'm going to see if I can't just stretch this metaphor all the way out until we're all sick and tired of it. So now we're going to work towards clean and shiny dishes. So in our efforts to build our dishwasher usage expertise, what I want to do is I want to take some of the paradigms that we have used for response and have us talk a little bit differently about them, reconsider what new shape they might take when we carry them over to prevention. And so we're going to look at these four paradigms because I think these are the four paradigms that are most closely connected to SAPM and our Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month activities. And so problem focus, this need to address a problem, to bring awareness to a problem, is of course an important place to start, right? We can't build a response system. We can't build policies. We can't mobilize resources towards sexual assault until people are willing to acknowledge that sexual assault is a problem to begin with, right? Until people understand the scope of the problem, the definition of the problem, the statistics related to the problem, right? And with sexual assault in particular, not only was there a lack of knowledge and acknowledgement about it, there was also actively sweeping it under the rug, right? There was actively people going, nope, it doesn't happen here. It's not an issue here. And so folks had to get together and they had to go, we got to keep coming at this thing. We're going to do presentations and we're going to educate people. We're going to do information tables and we're going to hand out flyers and brochures. We're going to put posters up that have statistics. We're going to bring victims, survivors to come in and they're going to tell their stories. We're going to saturate these environments with the knowledge of the problem that people need, right, as a foundation to moving forward. It is an absolute prerequisite. Once we get to a point, right, where people understand that there is a problem, if we continue to only talk about sexual assault through the lens of the problem, one of the things we risk is creating a sense of fatigue, right? Creating a sense of hopelessness, right? If I've been on my installation for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and every year someone comes in and tells me about the problem, and they tell me the same statistics they've told me year after year after year, we run the risk of people going, yeah, this is never going to change, right? This just is what it is, and I've been hearing the same thing over and over and over. And there can really be a sense, not only among those we're trying to reach, but even among ourselves. Right? Like how many of us as those that are professionals in this field even find ourselves sometimes letting go of the possibility, consciously or not, that this could actually be different. Just kind of settling into knowing that we're not going to have to change our slide next year because the statistics are going to be the same. Right? And so once there was an awareness of the problem, what I'm going to suggest is as we pivot to prevention, we now can create a space for the solution. We can create a space because now they buy it. Now, if you step on any given installation, most people acknowledge that this is an issue, that this is a problem. So now let's talk about the solution, right? Let's come up with opportunities. Let's come up with resources. Let's come up with approaches to actually begin to get this problem under control and begin to shift the tide around this issue, right? You can, if you look on the left-hand side and you look at the response paradigm of awareness, it's a natural build on what I'm already talking about, right? That we spent all this effort on awareness, right? Getting people to know. And again, think of the activities, the fun runs and the speakers, those kinds of things to keep awareness up. We have succeeded. You all have succeeded. People are aware, right? The vast majority of people, because of your voices, because of your efforts, know that this is a thing now. If we keep focusing our efforts on increasing awareness about an issue that people are already aware of, we run a couple of really significant risks. Right? The first risk is that there is people will get fatigued, right? Have any of you ever heard folks say, like, haven't I already heard this? Here we go again, right? People might even begin to get resentful. You are telling me something I already know. I could be doing my job, right? Why am I having to sit here and hear this again, right? And another risk of awareness, continuing to focus most of our resources on awareness activities, is we're spending a lot of time and a lot of money doing this, but there's little added value because you can't be more aware than aware. If I know, I know, right? And so the paradigm shift we might consider when we are looking through the prevention lens is moving from awareness to action. Like with knowledge, right? Like with understanding the problem, awareness was never the end goal. It was a necessary first step, right? So now that they're aware, how do we begin to refocus on the prevention side, right? And translate that awareness into action? How do we begin to build skills, right? How do we begin to modify behaviors which are necessary to create the culture change to bring the numbers down, right? Culture change doesn't happen through awareness. It doesn't happen through knowledge. It doesn't even happen through attitude change. They have to come first But culture change necessary for reduction only happens when we change what we're saying and what we're doing, right? So is this making sense? So looking at this fourth one, looking at this last one, even when we, obviously within response, by definition of response, there is a reactive component. Something bad happens and we kick into enforcement mode. Something bad happens and we make sure victims have resources, right? It's reactive by definition and appropriately so. And even when we began to move over on the prevention side, our focus still remains predominantly reactive. So the bystander approach has become so common, is really, if you see something already happening, we're going to give you the tools to react, intervene, and do something about it, right? Again, this is completely appropriate on the response side. But when we move over to prevention, right, if we keep in the reactive mode, if we only mobilize when something bad happens, the next bad thing will always keep happening. We'll always just be waiting for the next bad thing. And so on the prevention side, let's consider building on that reactive and driving towards proactive. Even as I have to respond, what can we be doing to mobilize our people to set new norms, to set norms that are intolerant of sexual assault, right? That are intolerant of sexual assault and that really establish that in our community, in our branch, in our unit, on our base, on our ship, the expectation is we all take an active role in prevention. The expectation is we all look out for each other, that we're going to speak up, right? So the proactive is, how do we set those two norms? Sexual assault will not be tolerated and everyone's expected to do their part. So long before the next violent act is coming down the pike, we've created an environment that's inhospitable to that act ever emerging to begin with, right? So thinking through, right, some of these paradigm shifts, before we move away from that, I want to make really clear that this is not either or. We're not checking the response box and going, okay, we're done with that. Now we're going to discard it and move to prevention. The fact is both are necessary. So what we're talking about is building up the capacity of that dishwasher. So depending on whether I am wanting to make toast or wash a dish, I can pick which appliance is most appropriate. So in some rooms, in some circumstances, in some meetings, you're going to be looking through the response lens and you need to pick from the tools and the frameworks and the research that apply there. But in some rooms, you're going to be using the prevention framework, right? Your goal is going to be to stop the next act of violence, right? And so we need to have a toolkit that's equally effective for that side. So hear me say over and over and over, this is both and. I just want us as a field, and I want you as practitioners in that field to be able to pick and choose depending on what you're driving towards. So I hope all of that makes sense. I would read your body language and your eyes and your head nodding, but instead I'm just going to guess whether that makes sense. So we are now going to shift over and drill down just a little bit and thinking about thinking through the lens of these paradigm shifts. I want us to consider how can these things apply when we actually get into SAPM planning. So the first thing I want to think about is when you think about planning an event, asking ourselves, what is the desired outcome of that event? What am I trying to accomplish? And there are three goals to me that kind of came to mind that often inform what we're doing. The first is kind of what I call positive branding. And what I mean by that is, as you all have experienced with sexual assault, there's people have some pretty negative associations sometimes, right? Very often you hear men going, yeah, they just think we're all rapists, right? They just come in and talk about consent and the policies, and so men can be really alienated, or women are like, yeah, they just talk to us about what not to do, right? Don't walk alone, and don't drink too much, and don't do this and don't do that, and so they can feel pretty disempowered, and going, yeah, this is not for me. And for some of the reasons I just talked about in the previous slide, just generally, people can feel fatigued, right? I've had to come to this annual training every year forever, and they're saying the same thing, and I've already heard it, and why do I have to be there? And so for a lot of different reasons, people are feeling, there's lots of people feeling some negativity with this issue. And so when there's a place for our events that are where the goal legitimately can be, you know what, I want to start to create positive associations. I want to create a really cool event where people just come and have positive interactions with the SARCs, and people have positive interactions with this issue. They leave going, yeah, we had some great conversation, and we did this fun run, and we ran through this paint, or we baked this cake, and it was this cool competition. That the end goal really is just for people to have a positive experience, so that when they think of this issue, they go, oh yeah, that's something that I have felt good about. I had this really great experience. And that's a legit goal. It's just knowing this is my goal. This is what I'm setting out to do, create a positive experience. What I want you to consider when you are sitting with that goal is balancing building the positive brand, building the positive associations with potential fatigue, right? So we don't want to offset any possible gains of a positive brand we don't want to offset that with, oh gosh, this is the 19th event this month. And I'm just sick of seeing the poster for the next event, right? So that's just kind of a consideration. And as I talk through some of these ideas, I'm curious if you want in the chat box, what are some of the reactions you've had about SAPM month generally, or about specific events? Are you relating at all to some of the associations I'm talking about, or some of the reactions, both positive and negative, to specific events or to SAPM generally? Another potential goal that you might be pursuing when you plan an event is, I want to increase knowledge around this issue, right? My end goal, it's a content-driven event, whether it's a speaker or a movie or a booth or a presentation, a theater troupe. My end goal is to increase knowledge. And obviously, again, reflecting back to the previous slide, you've got some really critical questions to consider. One is the content you are trying to convey, is the knowledge you are trying to build something they don't already know? Right? Are you saying something they haven't heard 100 times? And this isn't a trick question, right? Because sometimes your answer is no, they don't know this yet, because this issue is always emerging. So you may end up doing a presentation on what sexual assault is looking like in social media, how it's being used as a grooming ground, how, we've heard lots of controversy about where it's showing up. And so there's a natural growth area there. We need education about what this is looking like in social media, right? How does this apply to other populations, right? Transgender populations, knowledge, increasing knowledge and awareness about the intersection with these other populations. So sometimes your answer will be, they don't already know this, right? Sometimes your answer will be, you know what, I've actually said this in 100 different ways. And maybe that goal has no added value, even if I hit it, right? The second question you see on the slide, if it's a specific audience you're targeting, how will you get them to the event? In other words, maybe you say, most of my population knows the content I want to present on, but there are these subgroups, right? Maybe it's brand new airmen or soldiers, right? Brand new sailors that are coming into my unit or in my community that I want to educate. So how are you going to make sure those are the ones that show up? right? Maybe there's some other particular subgroups, leadership or certain units that you're going, hey, there's a take on this that I think is unique to them that I want them to know about. And so how are you going to make sure they're the ones that show up, as opposed to very often kind of the same people that show up and actually have heard that same message. The third possible goal or desired outcome for your event is actual prevention, right? And there's, based on, again, on the last slide, there's a couple of guiding questions that can be really important. One is, if prevention is the goal, are you actually filling this space with conversations about the solution, right? Or is a lot of it hearing victim stories, or is a lot of it hearing a speaker, again, talk about the numbers and the impact of this issue? Is the space, maybe even 100% of the space, focused on what we can do about it, right? How we can do better, how we can get folks engaged. The second prompt to consider is, are there elements that are actually skill building? Because remember, prevention isn't rooted in knowledge or attitude change alone. Prevention is rooted in changing behaviors, right? Building skills that drive behaviors, what people say and what people do on a daily basis. And what we know from adult learning and learning transfer is that for people to actually adopt a new skill and do it on a daily basis, they have to have practice. They have to have practice more than once, right? They have to have it across different settings and different contexts before they really internalize that and it becomes a habit. The final prompt is that you want to consider for prevention is, are the target behaviors reactive, proactive, or both? And don't hear me dissuade reactive, like we really do want to build skills associated with reactive, recognizing high-risk situations, understanding what might keep people from getting involved, having realistic solutions. Those are important, and we want every person within our community to have those skills. But again, we don't want to get stuck there. So we want some of our events, right, focused on proactive behaviors. How are they going back into their communities and having conversations with the people around them that make clear these are our values, right? This matters to us. If you want to fit in here, right, you're going to take prevention seriously. How do we train them to use their other platforms, social media, or within their spheres of influence? Maybe they lead meetings, maybe they give speeches. How do we teach them the skills of embedding in those natural spheres of influence ways to communicate the expectations, the norms, that violence won't be tolerated and everyone's expected to do their part? So I'm going to pause a minute. I see lots of different comments coming up. I have had conversations about why, oh, and it went. That's okay. What are some of the, what are, yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of different ideas of the kind of programs people do. And it actually leads, or really interestingly, into another point that I was going to make, this idea of we're bringing different events in. And again, there's not a particular event that's good or bad, right? It's about aligning it with your goal. But seeing a lot of different programs coming up, I want to bring up this this idea that I'll reiterate a little bit later, which is this idea of dose, right? So in fact, I'm going to skip ahead and then I will come back to this since it's what's naturally come up, right? That when you think about the events, so we know during SAPM, there tends to kind of be a flurry of events. So when you think about those, are you anchored to the goals you have established for that year? Right? So have you thought, okay, this year, the behavior we want to drive, for example, is intervening in high-risk situations. Maybe the behavior you want to drive is really effectively using social media platforms to establish norms, right? So what's the goal? What's the behavioral goal? Because again, a prevention goal needs to be based in behavior. And are then all of the events you do, not just during SAPM, but throughout the year, are they driving to that goal? And so asking yourself, when you think about One Love or this theater troupe, Catharsis Productions, when you think about the folks that are coming in, can you link back? If I said, how does this connect back to your annual behavioral goal? Can you make that connection? Very often, what happens and what I have done historically is the decisions I make about the activities I'm going to bring in during Sexual Assault Awareness Month and Awareness and Prevention Month is basically like, who's cool that's on the circuit right now? What's the latest movie? Hey, they just released this movie and it's got some really important key themes. Oh, a colleague of mine just told me about this really cool event that they did, so I want to try it here. And it can be this a process of selecting that's not as deliberate as it needs to be. So instead of having 4 or 5 events that contribute to sustained dosage, right? Because again, we know to internalize a behavior, we want people to have more than one dose. We want them to come at it in different ways several times, right? For them to engage in that behavior consistently. So instead of having this opportunity where we've selected every event as a repeated dose of this same goal, the same behavioral goal, instead we end up picking 5 or 6 different events that actually aren't related in any way. So instead of repeated doses, what we have is one dose of 5 different messages, right? And so not only do you not have the strengthening effect of repeating a dose on the same theme, but sometimes that can just create a lot of noise. It can create a sense of clutter, right? I've got so many kind of competing messages. And I have, again, historically, I've actually inadvertently brought in events that had contradictory messages, right? And what is that? What's the then experience of the end user, and what's the impact on prevention if we don't deliberately thread these things together? While I'm on the dosage slide, so I say all that to say, as I saw lots and lots of different events coming up, that's a lens I'd like you to consider. How are these related, and are they anchored back to your behavioral goals for your particular community? While we're on this dosage slide, let me make a couple of other key points. You do want to the research tells us that in terms of dose, we're going to have the greatest impact when it's spread over time. When it's not just back to back over the course of a month, I've got 5 or 6 different things. I want you to give me a chance to practice. I want a sense for, an opportunity for application. And then I want a week or a month or 3 months or 4 months to go by, right? And then you're going to give me another dose of it, right? Then a little more time is going to go by. Then you're going to give me another dose of it. And so considering the importance of that, when you think about SAPM, I know it's something Julie is going to speak to about how much we do in SAPM and some of the goals they have in the Navy. But consider what it would be like to take some of the intensity of events that we do in SAPM and spread those out over time, spread them out over the course of the year. I hope that is making sense. So I appreciate some of the feedback on that. I'm going to back up and come back so the first in kind of review, the first thing we considered when thinking about our SAPM events and strengthening prevention is really asking ourselves, what's the goal? Is it positive branding? Is it increasing knowledge and awareness? Or is it actual prevention? And making sure whatever that goal is the end goal of that event will accomplish that goal. The other consideration, I think, for informing our events is actually expanding the definition of what an event even is. In a program, in a training that I do within my organization, we develop something that we call action events. And the notion for me was kind of taking the notion, the more traditional notion of awareness events, and adding an element of action, right? So the phrase action events came up. And what I found was it takes us in the right direction. Because what it does is we go, okay, I did this traditional awareness event, say a fun run. And the goal was positive branding associations. The goal was to increase some knowledge. We had some tabling there. We had some people talking to folks as they came and registered for the run. And I said, okay, what could I do, right, to add elements of prevention, elements of skill build, right? So it's like, okay, I could get people to come to this event. And again, I won't get into too much detail because Julie is going to touch on it, but I could have them come to this event, and instead of just having awareness, I'm going to insert some sort of skill build. Right? They're going to do some sort of activity that actually requires hands-on application. So that's a step in the right direction. And if that's a step you can take in your upcoming SAPM, that's a really positive step, and it's going to drive us in the right direction. The next step, right, that kind of opens up how we think about it would be to replace the word events. And so a phrase we've been playing with is community mobilizing initiatives. That I, of course, use the phrase, now say CMIs, because I know in the military, you all mainly talk in letters. And so I want to be cool and popular, so I will now say CMIs. And the reason I played with that language, because even though it was called action event, event still pulls for at a certain time, I'm going to ask you to show up. I'm going to ask you to attend something. And then when it's over, you're going to leave. And the limitations of that is twofold. Number one is there's event fatigue, right? One more program we got to go to. And I've heard that a lot. Folks going, really, Dorothy, we got to put up one more event, this action event, like people are burned out of coming to events. So that's one issue. The second issue with limiting how we think about prevention to specific events is that culture change doesn't happen in the context of an hour-long program. Ultimately, we need to translate, right, the behaviors we're trying to change to the community, to people's quote unquote natural habitat, to the workspaces, to their church spaces, to their family spaces, to their social spaces. And so thinking about how we build prevention capacity, instead of thinking about events, we could begin to expand our thinking to initiatives that instead of being built around a certain place or time, it's actually built around the behavioral goals. Right? And so what can I do? How can I build an initiative that would actually equip people to not show up to an event, but to increase some of these proactive behaviors the next day at work? Right? How can I build an initiative that will increase the likelihood that individuals that night at dinner will have some conversations around the dinner table, or next time they get online, they're going to increasingly like or comment on positive posts, right? And so it just kind of opens up our creativity, right? Of what if I had an initiative based on a shared goal, right? As a community, as a base, we're going to generate 1,000 conversations in our workplaces in the next week about prevention. And how could we equip our community to do that, right? So it's just some different ways of thinking about this, opening up that language. So I think a really awesome first step is to take events that you already have going on, that actually focus mostly on knowledge and awareness, and see if there's one or two elements you could add to it that would build skill, that would build behavior. A next step, depending on where people are, because people are in a lot of different places, maybe to open up even further and think of it again through community mobilization, thinking about it through this broader frame, this looser frame of initiatives. And so first consideration is what's your goal? Second consideration is expanding our understanding of what events means and how we can utilize them to leverage behavior change. The third one that we've already talked about is thinking about dosage, right? Making sure not only that there's multiple doses, but that there's multiple dosages is over a period of time, and that the doses are reinforcing the same target behavior. I've already touched on some of these next steps. Consider replacing some of the events with CMIs. Pick whatever language you want. Consider doing fewer events, instead spreading them over the year. Consider adding a skill building component to existing events. Consider eliminating and not just replacing. Consider paring down some. Get a read on in your community of where is fatigue, right? Like, would you have a better effect really focusing in on a couple of key things? And finally, consider inserting opportunities for proactive skill building and not just reactive. So I am actually going to pause here and answer a couple of questions before I turn this over to Julia. One question that came up is, how do you determine a behavioral goal? For me, honestly, when it comes to prevention, there's actually you're going to end up with some version of two primary goals, because what we know is we need behavior change, right? And so there's two strands to that. There is reactive behaviors, and there's proactive. So within reactive, you may have a goal as general as, hey, let's increase reactive behaviors, or you may drill down further into that. You may have, what my goal for this year is, we're really seeing through the data that when people see something, they're likely to intervene, but hardly anyone is actually noticing anything. So maybe you'll have a behavioral goal that year where you'll go, you know what, we need to really train up people's ability to recognize risk, right? Maybe they're not noticing anything until there's something really acute happening, right? Really urgent happening. And that's the first time they notice, which is why they're saying, I hardly ever see anything, because that acute, imminently high risk, we just don't walk by every day, right? But we all know that the reality is there's warning signs much, much earlier in the process. And maybe what our community needs is the increase the ability to recognize those earlier warning signs, right? What does it look like when someone's first pushing on boundaries? What are some of the things that might show up on social media that would indicate some targeting that's happening, right? What kind of language, right? Even verbally pushing on boundaries might folks notice? What is the early stages of isolation look like, right? What's the difference between, hey, I'm at a bar and I'm watching someone say, hey, can I buy you a drink? And that just being a perfectly acceptable pickup line, right? Versus someone that's buying someone a drink and pressuring them to drink and always making sure their glass is never empty, right? So maybe that's one of your behavioral goals, right? It's drilled down even more than just a broad reactive. Maybe the behavioral goal is, you know what, they're doing great with reactive. I'm going to, and they're actually having lots of proactive conversations in their daily life, but our social media is running rampant. There's lots of really destructive messages there. So maybe that year your goal is, we want to take over our social media realm, the virtual realm, with positive messages around this. So those are some ways to think about behavioral goals. I just encourage you to, again, think both reactive and proactive. The second question that kind of came up, a theme that comes up constantly, of course, is resource constraints, right? And the beautiful thing, number one, is resource constraints really drive towards do fewer things, right? And so if you go back to those original paradigms and you go, you know what, I could spend a lot of money and I could spend a lot of time bringing in this speaker, but they're actually going to, and the speaker's super popular, right? But they're actually going to talk about something that people already know, right? Maybe that's one of the things we could eliminate. The second is the beauty of culture change is it doesn't require money. It doesn't cost me any money to talk to my colleague at work about a news story that I heard and work into that conversation how I really believe there's a role for us to play in intervention, right? In prevention. So our job becomes, if you had zero money, like if you had $0 and all you had was you and a couple of VAs, a couple of volunteers, what could you do? Well, you could get in front of training rooms and you could use those annual training events, annual training requirements to talk about how they can go back to their communities, to give them concrete daily skills where they could go back to their natural spheres of influence, right? And impact those norms. A community mobilizing initiative, there's no cost. Like putting on an event and renting the space and bringing the pizza that will bribe them to come and paying for the speaker, that all costs. But running off a bunch of quarter sheet pieces of paper that have 10 tips of things you could do tomorrow at home or at church or at work to establish norms, that costs as much as Xeroxing those old copies and passing them out through the various work units. So those are two really great questions. And I will turn this over to Julia, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some further discussion. So really appreciate it.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Julia Strange. I'm a SAPR program analyst. I've been with Commander Navy Installations Command since 2011. And at CNIC, we provide training and policy guidance, as well as develop tools and resources for Navy sexual assault response coordinators. So that will be the perspective from which I am talking today. And April 2018, I just realized, is going to be my 7th SAPM with the Navy. So today, my plan is to share with you from a programmatic level how the Navy will be approaching this paradigm shift that Dr. Edwards just presented, from response and awareness to primary prevention during Sexual Assault Awareness Month and around the year. And I also plan to share some tools that can assist with this transition and give some examples from the field today. Okay. So again, much like DoD, this is going to be a paradigm shift that's going to take place in phases. We're not looking for a completely new approach this upcoming April, but we're looking at the steps that we can take towards that shift. So first, I'd like to talk about how our SAPM planning process at CNIC has evolved over the past 7 years. So, of course, from the perspective of our office, we focus on our Navy SARCs. I see a lot of you on the webinar today, and we see them as the center of gravity for SAPM planning. But we do also encourage our SARCs to collaborate with a variety of stakeholders to ensure broad engagement and a holistic approach. So in support of SAPM planning, we developed the very first SAPM toolkit back in 2013. And since then, we have released 5 updated editions. So, and in order to keep improving this product, we developed a feedback loop in which we gather information about SAPM events, including identified best practices and lessons learned from our SARCs every year. And so this information, I then get to look at what people's SAPM events looked like, and then comb through a lot of really wonderful best practices, promising practices, as well as lessons learned. And then we integrate that into the next year's version of the SAPM toolkit. So we've seen this toolkit grow over the past 5-6 years, large part thanks to our folks in the field who have been very generous in providing feedback and showing us how they've continued to evolve their events, their practices. We do also check in with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center on an annual basis to discuss civilian events and best practices. And I just do want to give a shout out to NSVRC because they do also put out an annual Sexual Assault Awareness Month toolkit and other planning tools each year. So that's a really great website that we use all the time to get ideas. Okay. So here's the first sneak peek of the 2018 Navy SAPM Toolkit. It's the 6th edition. It was actually finalized and approved this morning. So we will be making that available on SAPR Connect. I will also be sending it out to our Navy folks, and we'll make sure that that is available to all of you here on the webinar today. And again, in order to help guide this paradigm shift, we made the following updates to the toolkit. A new section that was very much based off of Dr. Edwards' work, is a section called Event Planning to Spotlight Primary Prevention. You can see the first page up on your screen. And so this gives some pretty simple tips for how to differentiate between those prevention-focused versus a response or awareness-focused elements of your SAPM events. And it gives some various steps that you can take what you've got now and start to shift over to prevention. So just a few quick tips from there that I can cover today. Something such as developing a prevention call to action, having a specific, asking people to engage in a specific pro-social behavior. And so for one example, the Navy will have a service-wide call to action this year. It's very simple, it's very broad. We are going with raise your voice for prevention. And what we are planning to do with that, because it is so broad, we're going to utilize our marketing materials to give very specific, accessible ways people can raise their voice for prevention in everyday life. Another approach you can take is ensuring that you are aligning your prevention messaging, and Dr. Edwards mentioned this as well, making sure that if you do have an outside speaker or maybe somebody from a different program, that you are checking in with them and making sure that what they will be putting out there is in line with what your goals are, what you want to put out there. And then, of course, Dr. Edwards also mentioned the idea of either replacing replacing an awareness event with a prevention event, or integrating prevention elements into an event that may originally have had an awareness or response focus. And that integration piece is really important. We're not asking people to scrap everything you've ever done in the past. There's a lot of really good stuff there, especially if it's something that you've done annually that people really seem to be into. There's a way to start shifting that to infuse prevention into those activities. And I will be giving some specific examples in a few minutes. So with that shift, asking yourself, is there a skill building component you can add? Can you tie in that prevention call to action either to the event or to your overall, monthly plan? How can you include active participation versus passive observation? Thinking about how you can introduce activities, things where people are actually getting to do and engage. Also, asking yourself, could this event be translated into a community mobilization initiative? Is it something that could lend itself to a CMI? So, and then of course, you can also just come up with something new, something completely new, a prevention-focused event or CMI, and not just during April. This could also be something that could take place at other times of year, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. Additionally, the SAPM toolkit has an event ideas section, has 75 event ideas. These are categorized as prevention and awareness events, leadership engagement events, group activities, contests, creative activities, a lot of different ideas. And this is probably the section that has grown the most over the past 6 years, as we see a lot of really new and fresh ideas come from the field each year. And in this year's toolkit, you'll still see about, a number of prevention and awareness events, but we are looking in future years to really build up that prevention-focused content and probably to pare back a bit on that awareness-focused. Some other tools that you can find in the toolkit that can be helpful in your planning process includes an event planning things to consider checklist. You can see a little part of that page peeking up on your screen. We also included a suggested planning timeline with various tasks that generally need to be taken care of, a certain number of months before SAPM arrives, as well as a section towards the end that includes sexual assault information and training resources. And this section has a lot of links to outside organizations, reports, sources of information that you can pull from when you're looking for information on topics such as social norms approach, active intervention, healthy sexuality, healthy relationships, masculinity, and healthy gender concepts. Included some outside resources for that. And then the toolkit also includes a number of marketing and social media templates, sample content tips on how to really harness those pieces to work for you. I know some people were talking about resources, and that is always a challenge. But I'm a huge proponent of social media as a very it can be a very effective and also a very free resource for getting the word out about your events. And one last piece I wanted to highlight that will be new in this year's toolkit is just a brief highlight of a new product that has come out of the Navy called Signature Behaviors of the 21st Century Sailor. And this signature behaviors document and a lot of the activity that's taking place around it is a shift in the way the Navy is addressing destructive decisions. And it's very similar to the paradigm we're talking about today. It's shifting the focus to signature behaviors. And basically those are, what does right look like? And this has been a joint effort with the fleets, and that document is out there. You can get it through a link provided in the toolkit. And regardless of which service you happen to be working for or serving in, this document has a lot of great language you can integrate into your events and activities and marketing campaigns that talks about positive pro-social behaviors of a healthy workforce. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few general things that we have found to be effective, both for SAPM planning in general, as well as ways that can contribute to this paradigm shift to prevention. And I will also echo Dr. Edwards here. This year, we really want to emphasize quality over quantity. Every year we do that data call I mentioned where we get a list of all of the different events that people do every year. And year by year, these lists were growing longer and longer and longer. We were seeing installations that were having, 30, 40 events sometimes within the month. And we were realizing that we wanted to maybe shift the way we were defining a successful SAPM. And the main theme to keep in mind there is that quality over quantity. Because especially if this isn't your first year organizing SAPM, you know that SAPM fatigue is very real. We see this manifest in reduction in participation towards the end of the month. And when this happens, your message loses its power. And we want to make sure that message is too important to lose that. So with that quality over quantity, thinking about that dosage, about balancing to avoid SAPM fatigue, and really pouring your energy into a few high quality events. And what we ended up calling those are signature events. We encourage people to have a few of these that they can build on from year to year. This could be an event of any scale. It can be large or small. Typically, they tend to be larger and they tend to be held annually. And that means that rather than having to reinvent the wheel every year, you are able to build on what you learned the previous year, and you're able to build on that event. And these events also can lend themselves to this shift. And I'll talk about a few specific examples of how that shift can take place. So the two I wanted to highlight today are theater events and obstacle courses, slash fun runs, slash sports events, anything along those lines. So especially for those of you in the Navy and Marine Corps, you've seen that theater events have grown in popularity across the Navy enterprise, especially during SAPM, including civilian theater groups such as Pure Praxis. I know they've been around to many installations, and internally organized theater events. In theater, it's a great tool for engaging service members. You can engage them in the actual production of these. In the planning, execution, it's a great way to gain buy-in. And one specific theater event that I want to highlight was originally started in Navy Region Japan and has since been adopted by multiple Navy regions around the world. And it's called SCREAM Theater. That stands for Sailors Challenging Reality and Educating Against Myths. And this program was adapted by Navy Region Japan with permission from a Rutgers University program called Students Challenging Reality and Educating Against Myths. And so what has been so powerful about this event is that it truly is driven by service members. They the scripts are written by service members. The skits are then directed and performed and narrated entirely by active duty service members, tend to be on the younger side too, with SARC support and guidance. And past performances have addressed a variety of topics, including drug and alcohol facilitated sexual assault, use of power in sexual assault, and male victimization. And annually, this event has had a wide reach. They've reached thousands of service members who, both in Japan and in other Navy regions around the world, who have been in attendance. So this type of event, it's now something that's been done year after year. People know about it. There tends to be some excitement around it, wanting to be involved. And so this is a great event where you don't want to scrap something like this. This is something that has a lot of value to it. And what you can do is you can do those baby steps, that shift that we've been talking about. And so a few ways that you can introduce this prevention focus is put out a call for scripts that specifically illustrate prevention strategies in action. This could be anything from bystander intervention and so on, and engage the audience in dialogue during or after the performance. So think about ways that you can move from having a performance to having those performers and the audience actually interact with each other. And because the act of thinking through a response, potentially practicing it, or at least discussing those options and maybe hearing good ideas that others may have, is a great way for people to leave that event with a few more tools in their toolbox. And of course, those play-acted scenarios, when we're talking about reactive versus proactive, those play-acted scenarios don't necessarily need to be talking about a potential sexual assault. These can include other behaviors along, the Navy uses the term continuum of harm. They can include behaviors that are maybe further down that continuum, how to address problematic behaviors such as, responding to a sexist joke or, inappropriate comments, and helping people think about ways that they can contribute to foster a healthier climate that way. So, and one last thing with this theater piece, especially if it is involving younger service members, is just keeping in mind the power of peer influence and how theater can be a tool that you can use to really harness that influence for positive results. The other area of events that we've seen utilized as signature events over the past couple of years, of course, are these types of physical events where you have obstacle courses, fun runs, so on. And traditionally, these tend to have been more awareness focused. They may have an opening speaker. There may be sexual assault statistics posted along the route. And again, if this is a popular event, a great first step would be to brainstorm ways in which to include prevention elements as opposed to trying to come up with something completely new. And we have seen some really creative prevention-focused events incorporated in these types of sports events in recent years. Two examples I wanted to call out for their innovation here is the amazing SAPR race at Naval Air Station Pensacola and the SAPR Challenge, which was started at Naval Base Kitsap in Washington. And in these and others, we've seen some really creative skill building components that were built in where there were stations where you might role play, engage in a role play activity where you're given a scenario and you have to practice a response to a situation. Also, some have had stations where people have thought about ways to respond to things like victim blaming. Ways to kind of shift that climate where it's not okay to say those types of things, and all of that feeds into creating an environment where sexual assault Okay, we've resumed recording. I don't know what little nugget of brilliance it cut out on, but I was just mentioning that some folks have looked ahead and were able to utilize these types of obstacle obstacle course events with stations, activity stations. They were actually able to meet general military training, SAPR annual training requirements through the content that they presented, that they had people engage in. So a great way to make that uh, annual requirement fun and engaging. And one last piece that I did want to also mention is that there are a lot of civilian resources for how to engage athletes and sports teams in prevention. I do include some of this in the toolkit as well, but I just wanted to shout out to a few organizations. Um, Reliance has a sport and prevention center. This is an online tool. It was actually just launched last month. They've got a lot of great resources there. Of course, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, other programs such as Coaching Boys into Men and the organization Men Can Stop Rape. All of these organizations have a lot of great tools for how to utilize, you know, athletes, sports teams, and maybe more informally, these types of sports events, recognizing them as social and cultural influencers and harnessing that for prevention. Okay, and again, I know some folks were talking about resources and what a challenge that is. And one thing I often try to emphasize is the power of collaboration there. It's always been promoted as a great strategy for expanding your audience, but it's also great for sharing resources effectively and approaching sexual assault prevention in a holistic manner. So one example I wanted to give for the Navy, and I did see some folks in the chat pod mention CSAD, we have a group called the Coalition of Sailors Against Destructive Decisions, and a number of Navy bases have chapters of this organization. And this is a grassroots group. This is something that is just organized by younger sailors. And these groups tend to attract participants who are already invested in these issues and who are then provided training and tools to be effective peer leaders and mentors. And so no matter what service you happen to be with, try to think about what natural groups exist out there right now. And it may be a grassroots group like CSAD, it may be a local sports group that you have, but think about, especially younger service members, think about these folks who can give you a perspective that you may not have access to. These are people who can be sounding boards, who can help you brainstorm activities that would be relevant for them, would reach them and speak to them. So a very valuable perspective that you can gain. Some other potential collaborators can include other programs, other military programs or civilian programs that address shared risk and protective factors. And so this could be anything from equal employment opportunity, the family advocacy program, alcohol and drug abuse prevention, child and youth programs. There's a lot of different programs out there who also may have funding available to help with these types of initiatives. Of course, there's a number of associations out there. I can only speak to the ones I know in the Navy, but things like the Junior Enlisted Association, Chief Petty Officer Association, those types of groups that may have funding that they're able to use, or manpower, volunteers to support your efforts. And of course, especially if you're in a joint or multi-service environment, looking to your colleagues in the other services and working together on events and activities. And then, of course, looking beyond the fence line, if you're in an area with a university, if you happen to have a local sports team or sports club, your local law enforcement agencies, rape crisis centers, and then every state in the U.S. has a state sexual assault coalition, and thinking about how you might work and connect with those folks and what types of prevention resources they may have. Another thought that I wanted to share is collaborating with other programs is a great way to host events at other times of year. So we're talking about taking the pressure off of April, and we've been talking about the importance of dosage. So if you say, the example I will provide is teaming up with a family advocacy program. Say that you're local FAP program is hosting an event for Teen Dating Violence Prevention Month in February. And this is an opportunity where maybe you can be involved to talk about healthy relationships and healthy sexuality, and thinking about ways where other programs have these natural times of the year that they may be elevated. How can you insert your prevention message there? You know, work with them, support them, and then in turn, they'll also hopefully be there to support you during April and other times of the year. And again, just hammering home that collaboration can be a great way to share resources, because again, we know we get it. Resources can be really, really challenging, but there's folks out there that might be able to help ease that pressure and contribute. So what's next? First, I'll say I'm very excited to see how April 2018 goes. I'm very excited to put the 2018 SAPM toolkit out into the world, see what people are able to do with it and what suggestions and feedback they have. After this upcoming SAPM, we will be putting out requests for feedback on the toolkit, and we're going to be working on further refining the prevention content, including any additional prevention-focused event planning tips, event ideas, any other types of feedback that we get back from the field, as well as also I'm thinking specifically about that event ideas section and how I can take some of the ideas that are there right now and maybe do some translation. How would that look as a community mobilization initiative? How could that translate into a CMI? So we're looking to start to continue to build on those resources we have, and especially integrate feedback we get after this year, after everybody takes those initial steps that I'm hoping all of you are thinking about and committing to for this year. And of course, we'll also continue to add to the social media marketing resources section, continuing to add tips on how to make those effective resources to get your message out. And we also recognize that evaluation is critical, of course, to ensuring that what we do has an impact. So we'll be looking into adding evaluation tools for future years. And then, of course, when it is released, we're also very excited for the DoD Prevention Plan of Action, which we will also make sure is echoed throughout the SAPM toolkit. So with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation. So I see we have, if you have any questions from folks on the line. Let's give a minute. I see a few people typing. Okay. What we'll do with those questions, we'll be capturing those in the chat pod, and we will make sure that we get to all of them. Right.
When she said we'll make sure we get to all of them, she underestimated how long my answers tend to be. I just wanted to touch on a couple that came up earlier that were brought to my attention, and I wanted to foot stomp one of these themes about partnerships. Obviously, it's so key in a million different ways. It's key in terms of resource sharing. It's key in terms of providing that repeat dosing. And I want to drill down into it even a little bit further. Part of collaboration is kind of planning events together, right? Resource sharing, supporting each other, finding opportunities to integrate. And collaboration could even go a little bit deeper in terms of if there's a sense of fatigue, if people are kind of over-evented. Collaboration can look like working together to understand when you're in front of a room, what's the content that you're presenting? Here's the content that I'm presenting. How could we foot stomp each other's messages within a presentation, right? So if I know in the suicide prevention training that folks have to go through, they talk about barriers to getting involved. This is what makes it hard for me to get involved, right? Then when I'm doing my sexual assault training, I can say, you know, just like you talked about, when you did your suicide prevention training. Intervening with sexual assault can also have some barriers, can also be difficult sometimes. And with literally 1 or 2 sentences like that, where you borrow each other's language and reference each other's training, there's a really sophisticated form of integration that doesn't add another event and yet provides a booster to each other's work without another training. So I just kind of want to put that out there. Another thing is when we're thinking about how we're evaluating things like awareness, or things like our events, whether they're awareness events or CMIs, really be thinking about how do you know if it's working? Like, how do you know if it was an impactful event, right? And one of the things, I was talking about those paradigm shifts earlier, and, one of the things we've developed on the response side was this lens of, if I can help one victim, if I can reach one person, that's a really positive outcome. However, when we took that framework and we brought it over to prevention, what that did was allow us to be satisfied with anecdotes, with single stories. So we put on an event and one person or 2 people come up to us and say, I really liked that event. Right? That event really had an impact on me. And there's 2 issues here. Number one is 1 or 2 people engaging doesn't mean you had the impact you wanted, right? Because when it comes to prevention, we actually need a whole lot of people doing behavior change. The second deconstruction of that is that liking something isn't the same as impact, right? Because I liked it doesn't mean I walked away doing a different behavior. And so when you think about, did I have an impact? Did this event accomplish what I want? Make sure you're driven, make sure you're anchored to the question, what did I want, right? So if we're moving into skill building for prevention, what you want to be able to assess, the questions you want to be asking are they engaged in new behavior since they left, right? Did I do some skill building that as a result, they're more likely, right, to demonstrate something new? So I just want to kind of put in perspective when we think about traditionally understanding the impact of our SAPM, that we want to think about, number one, liking isn't in and of itself enough. And number 2, you really want to be looking at numbers, not just 1 or 2 anecdotes, but lots of people actually engaging in a new way.